everybody. Bom dia a todas e todos. We have today with us Kostas Kampourakis, professor at the University of Geneva. And I'm going to put some presentation here. Just a minute, please. I want to show you his website. So here we are. This is the section of biology, Faculty of Science of the University of Geneva. The page in which we have Kostas Kampourakis production is a very long list of publications. So this is his university connections. And here at the end, you can find the link for his own website, where you have all his materials. And I want to show you, to highlight for you how huge is his production. He's an author and an editor of a huge quantity of books. So here is one of the series. He's editing some of the books. He is the author, like this Understanding Evolution, but he invited many specialized people to write about other things, and such as Glenn Branch, for instance, that Understanding Creationism, that is our invited speaker for the last class of this course. And if you go to other parts of his website, you'll find that he was the editor of the Science and Education from 2015 to 19. And I want to highlight this because this journal is specialized in the use, the contributions of history, philosophy, and sociology of science to science education. So this is a very important journal for us because it is kind of responsible, or the motor, or the core for the connection between these two different areas, that is HPS with science education. And so you have many, many wonderful works to read here too. So this is my brief presentation. I prefer now just to leave you all with Kostas. Welcome with us, Kostas. So,
thank you very much, Maria Elice. I'm very happy to be here. I'm grateful for the invitation to have the opportunity to give this talk among other distinguished scholars who work in this discipline. So I see that there's a lot of people here waiting. I will begin with my presentation, and I will just say, as we discussed in the beginning, that if people have questions, they should feel free to ask me. I'm happy to respond. Otherwise, we can have a discussion in the end. In any case, I don't intend to talk for more than 45 minutes, so there will be plenty of time for discussion. So I am now sharing my screen, and I hope that... can you see my presentation?
Yeah.
Okay. So, when Maria Elice invited me to give the talk, I thought that it would be interesting to talk about Charles Darwin from a different perspective, which, as you can see, relates somehow to education. And I will be talking about Darwin's conceptual change. This is not primary historical work that I have done. It relies, as you will see, on the work of numerous historians. But I've tried to how he made a shift from natural theology in the beginning of his career as a naturalist to natural selection towards the publication of The Origem of Species. I was looking about something to show his connection of or the connection of Darwin to atheism, and I found this collection of pins. You see that these are pins about atheism, and you can see that Darwin and his photo are here. And it's not rare to find people saying that evolution leads to atheism and that Darwin was an atheist. For instance, the Discovery Institute, which, as you know, is one of the institutions focused on creationism, there's an author here who says that Darwin may have referred to himself as an agnostic rather than an atheist. However, this was done for political purposes because at the practical level, he was an atheist, he rejected God. And of course, I'm not trying to say that evolution cannot drive one to become an atheist, but what I want to say is that evolution is not inherently atheistic. One can understand the theory and then decide what one believes about God and religion. And I'm going to show that this is not the shift that Darwin underwent. It's not the shift from theism to atheism that characterizes his life and work. You all know, of course, the big accomplishment of his life, The Origin of Species, the book that was published in 1959. And for many people, it has been considered one of the most important books ever written. And the interesting thing with Darwin is that we currently have available not only every book or manuscript that he has ever written in this website called Darwin Online, but also his correspondence in the Darwin Correspondence Project. So essentially, it is possible to follow his thinking and to follow the development of his theory across the years by reading what he was writing at each particular case. And as you will see, I will quote him, and I will quote both his writings and his correspondence at various places in my presentation. So let's begin with what happened before Darwin. There were many naturalists, you see many French people here, who had developed a variety of evolutionary views before Darwin in the context of debates about the stability of species. There were, of course, others, but the interesting figure here is Erasmus Darwin, who was Charles' grandfather. So in 1794, he published Zoonomia, in which, as you can read here, he was wondering whether it would be too bold to imagine that in a great length of time, since the Earth began to exist, perhaps millions of ages before the commencement of history of mankind, would it be too bold to imagine that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one common filament, or one living filament? As you can see here, he is talking about common descent, he is talking about deep time, and these are thoughts, preliminary evolutionary thoughts, which were relatively new at the time. In 1802, he published a poem, The Temple of Nature, in which he expressed similar thoughts. So this might make you think that, well, if you have a grandfather like this, it's not a surprise to become an evolutionist. But this is not the case for Darwin. As you can see, Erasmus died before Charles was born, and neither Charles nor his father Robert were the characters, the non-conformist characters that Erasmus was. Of course, there was a specific habit of mind at home. These were people who were free thinkers. They despised slavery. But it is not the case that Charles was an evolutionist or that he questioned religion right from the start. At the time that Charles Darwin was born, Jean Lamarck had produced perhaps the first evolutionary synthesis, in which, among other things, he proposed two laws for the transformation. He used the term transformism of species. One was what we call today use and disuse, that using particular organs strengthens them and make them better for a role, whereas permanent disuse may weaken and deteriorates them, and as well as the inheritance of acquired characters, for which he's most famous, that these changes that are induced because of the extended use or disuse can then be transmitted to the next generation. Here I should note that the common contrast is between inheritance of acquired characters in Lamarck and natural selection in Darwin, but you have to know that Darwin was perhaps more Lamarckian than Lamarck himself when it came to heredity, because he too accepted that the inheritance of acquired characters was possible. One of the major influences on Darwin was Charles Lyell, the prominent geologist, who in his book, Principles of Geology, he wrote a harsh criticism of Lamarck, and he noted, as you can read here, that it is important to note the important chasm in the chain of the evidence, because we might not imagine that he had merely omitted the illustration for the sake of brevity, but the plain truth is that there were no examples to be found. And while Lamarck talks of the efforts of internal sentiment, the influence of subtle fluids, and the acts of organization as causes whereby animals and plants may acquire new organs, he gives us names for things, and with a disregard to the strict rules of induction, resorts to fictions as ideal as the plastic virtue and other phantoms of the Middle Ages. In short, Lyell criticized Lamarck for developing a speculative theory, and that he noted that Lamarck had not been able to establish properly with empirical evidence what he was claiming. This is the background to what was going on before Darwin. There were some evolutionary theories in the air. The most important synthesis was that of Lamarck. Let's see now what Darwin did. He was born in Shrewsbury, and this is the school where he went from 1818 to 1824. Then he was sent by his father, who was a physician, to Edinburgh to become a medical doctor like his father and his older brother Erasmus. But this is not what Darwin wanted to do. He did not like this kind of work. He despised the brutality of surgery, which at the time was done without anesthetics. But while he was there, he met Robert Grant and studied natural history and worked with him. And this is very important because Robert Grant was probably the only teacher in Britain who was sympathetic to Lamarckism in the time before Darwin. So he was, in a sense, a proto-evolutionist, and he initially made Darwin aware of Lamarck's theory and other theories before him. Eventually, Darwin was sent by his father again to Cambridge to study at Christ's College that you see here, with a qualification that would make him something like a clergyman. And there he was, again, enormously influenced by two naturalists, Adam Sedgwick, who was a geologist, with whom he did a geological tour in the summer of 1831. But most importantly, John Henslow, who taught him, he was a botanist, he taught him how to collect and label plants, and instilled in him the idea of botanical endemism. This means that the idea that plants can be endemic in particular areas. This in turn means that they are found in those places and nowhere else. These were crucial influences for Darwin's later work, and especially during his trip to his voyage with the Beagle and his visit to the Kampourakis, which was arranged thanks to Henslow. Before getting into that, it is also important to know that while studying at Cambridge, Charles became familiar with the writings of William Paley. And the important idea here was the argument of divine design in nature. Historians have shown clearly that Darwin's lifelong fascination with the study of adaptation was due to Paley's influence on him. The difference, of course, is that William Paley, as you can see here, compared organisms to machines like a watch, and he said that whenever we see design and contrivance, this is another word for adaptation in a sense, in nature, I'm sorry, in an instrument, we ask, where does this come from? And we're trying to infer who was the intelligent person who did that, who designed that for a purpose. In that case, the watch. And he made the argument that we can make similar inferences for organisms and the complexity and the contrivances that we see in organisms. And in short, his point was that whenever we see purpose and design in nature, we must infer that there must have been an intelligent designer behind this who designed the structure as we see it. And if humans, he argues at another place in the book, are able to construct some such complex machines, such as a watch or a telescope, we can imagine that the person who, the agent who designed the eye, which is much more complex than a telescope, must be much more competent than humans, and this can only be God. This is a view that Darwin initially accepted with pleasure. And as I said, thanks to Henslow, he had the opportunity to travel aboard the HMS Beagle for many years. During that time, he made a voyage around the world, as you can see here, making many different visits in your area there in South America. And while he was aboard on the ship, he read Lyell's Principles of Geology. And even though Lyell rejected the idea of evolution, his theory of uniformitarianism, the idea that the natural processes operating in the past are the same with those that can be observed operating in the future, had an important impact on Charles' thought. An alternative view was catastrophism. And according to that view, it was possible to explain the changes on the surface of the Earth on the basis of big catastrophes. In contrast, what Lyell was arguing for was that we have mechanisms that operate for a long time and that gradually can bring about the changes that we observe. A crucial and famously important part of that voyage was his visit on the Galapagos, where he collected plants that he had intended to send back to Henslow, but also the famous Galapagos finches. However, it was not then, but after his return in England, that he realized that the Galapagos finches that he had collected belonged to different species, thanks to ornithologist John Gould, who examined what Darwin had brought back and reached this conclusion. So it's not that Darwin had a eureka moment in the Galapagos, but when he came back, he started putting the pieces he had collected together, and he started realizing that Paley's views might not be adequate to explain what he had observed in nature. I should also note that during this trip, he also had the opportunity to observe earthquakes, which was something that he had not seen before, and observe an enormous variation in the Galapagos and elsewhere, as well as endemic species that were found only there. And the crucial issue with the finches is that, and other organisms that he found, is that they were different from similar organisms that lived in similar environments. And this could not be explained by design. Why would the divine designer design different species living under the same conditions? So when he came back, he started writing down his notes, and in 1837, he came up with this drawing, which is the first example of a phylogenetic tree that he developed. And he started thinking about evolution and transmutation. However, he did that in a context in which there was always place for God. And here you can see something that he wrote in his notebooks. He wrote, astronomers might formally have said that God ordered each planet to move in its particular destiny. In same manner, God orders each animal created with certain form in certain country, but how much more simple and sublime powers let attraction act according to certain law, such are inevitable consequences. Let animals be created, then by the fixed laws of generation, such will be their successors. In short, he said that yes, God may have created species, but then he may have let them evolve through natural processes. This is something that is often described as theistic evolution. God created species and then natural processes have been operating for years. So, whereas Darwin begins to thinking about transmutation, this is how evolution was described at the time, there's always place for God in his initial thoughts. So, we see here that he begins his thoughts about transmutation under a strict sense of perfect adaptation. This means that there are places in the environment in which organisms can adapt, and this adaptation is perfect in a very strict sense. Let us now see how his views continue to change. In 1838, he read the essay on the principle of population by Malthus, in which the idea of struggle for existence in human societies was described. He says he wrote in his autobiography that he did that for amusement, but it seems that he had heard the ideas of Malthus before. This was something that was widely read at the time. After reading Malthus, Darwin realized that there were actually two types of struggle. There was interspecific struggle. This is struggle between different species, which was also advanced by Malthus. But he also noted that there also exists intraspecific struggle. This is struggle within species, which was practically neglected by Malthus. At the same time, he became interested in breeding and artificial selection. The pamphlets written by animal breeders such as John Sebright were explicit about the nature of power of artificial selection, and Darwin thought, if breeders can arrive at results like this by consciously selecting those varieties that they want to bring together, wouldn't it be possible for nature to do the same in a sense? So he thought that a similar process, an equivalent process with artificial selection might be operating in nature. He even joined several pigeon breeding clubs to see for himself how far selective breeding could go in producing new varieties. And so, as soon as he read Malthus' essay, he conceived of natural selection. And here is why Malthus and artificial, bringing together Malthus and artificial selection together was crucial. When we have a population, for instance here, of orange and green individuals, and we wonder how these population can evolve to one of orange individuals only, we can think that, well, we have artificial selection, a human selector allowed only the orange ones to breed, and this is how we ended up with a population that consists of only these individuals. However, how can the same take place in nature when there is no conscious selection? Natural selection cannot rely on an intelligent, conscious person, agent that does the selection. So the key here was the competition between species. And as Darwin realized, it was possible for the competition between species to play the same role in natural selection with the role of the human selector in artificial selection. And this is why Malthus was critical. He provided Darwin with a process, a mechanism that could explain how natural selection takes place in nature. There was nevertheless another reason. Darwin wanted his theory to align well with the philosophy of science of his time, and two prominent representatives were John Herschel and William Whewell, who believed that the aim of science was to find the laws of nature and then identify the true causes that guided these laws. So what Malthus' theory did was that it provided Darwin the quantitative law his theory required. The struggle for existence says that whereas we have an exponential growth in terms of people. We do not have a similar exponential growth in terms of resources, and so after a point there will be a struggle for existence. So that was a kind of law that could work well and could help explain how natural selection takes place. Now, in order to show that natural selection was a true cause, Darwin had to establish the existence of a cause by studying it in action, and he established the existence of natural selection on the basis of the analogy with artificial selection. The second step was to show that the cause is competent to produce the phenomena to be explained. And so Darwin aimed to show through a series of thought experiments the competency of natural selection in producing new species, even if it had never been observed to do so. And eventually, he had to show that the cause is indeed responsible for this phenomena. And this is something that Darwin actually never managed to do. He did not show that natural selection was actually responsible for speciation, and that was one of the major criticisms he received when the Origem was published. Around 1844, he had developed a sketch of his theory. He had an initial sketch of 1842, and then he developed another one that he shared with his wife, Emma. And he asked her, in the event of his sudden death, to see it to publication. He thought that his theory was important, but he was not yet ready to publish. At around the same time, he sent an abstract, this sketch of his theory, to Joseph Dalton Hooker, a botanist and a close colleague, in which he also explained that his experiences, his observations have led him to conclude, as you can see, that he writes here, that species are not immutable. In other words, his conclusion was that species can change, and when he wrote that, as you can see here, he wrote, it's like confessing a murder. Why does he say that? Because that was not the widely accepted view at the time. He had developed a theory, but he did not publish it then. Rather, he shared it with his wife and Hooker, and there were two reasons. One reason was the publication at the same year of the Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, which was published anonymously by Robert Chambers, which caused an evolutionary scandal because it brought to the fore issues that were not discussed. And Darwin was afraid that if he published his theory at the same time, it would be compared to the Vestiges. At the same time, he was aware of the criticism of Lamarck's theory by Lyell and others because of its speculative basis, and so he wanted to establish his theory as well as possible. However, at 1844, the theory that Darwin had developed, it's not the theory that we see in the Origem. There were still important pieces missing. At that time, Darwin had just abandoned the idea of perfect adaptation, which I mentioned earlier, that there is only one best possible form for any given set of conditions, for a quite similar view, the view of limited perfection, which nevertheless allowed the possibility of alternative forms and rudimentary organs. This is something that is evident in his writing, and these arguments come from this magnificent book by Dov Aspovat, who back in the 1970s analyzed the manuscripts and the writings of Darwin and arrived at these conclusions. So the theory that Darwin had in 1844 is not yet the theory we see in natural selection. It was a theory of perfect adaptation with limited perfection, which allowed for some change, but not much. At that time, Darwin also thought that there was little available variation, as perfectly adapted forms did not vary. If forms are perfectly adapted for some place and they are modified, then they will stop being perfectly adapted. Therefore, it was not possible to have a lot of variation. And the consequence of this was that a change in the external conditions was required for new variation to occur. But it was A few years later, that Darwin began his studies of the barnacles, which took him 8 whole years, and which eventually made him, in the end, realize that the variation available in nature was a lot more than what he had initially thought. In the meantime, his beloved daughter Annie died at the age of 10 years old, and this really caused him great sorrow and pain. Perhaps he had influenced his religious views. But the most important thing is that what we saw by that time was a transition, a gradual transition that allowed for more and more variation and less perfection. Then, around 1854, 1855, we see at the writings of Darwin a new idea, the principle of divergence, which was based on the idea of the division of labor, which in turn explained how natural selection could produce the branches of the tree of life. It is not clear whether he was directly influenced by Adam Smith or he was influenced by Henry Milner Edwards, a zoologist, who in turn might have been influenced by Adam Smith. But the point is that he adopts a new idea which brings about a critical modification in the theory. If we have a population that evolves, which is in competition with other species, and because of that, in a particular environment, we can have selection. Because, for instance, the red ones you see here are predators, and the orange ones have a better concealment in the environment. It is nevertheless possible for these green individuals to find a new place, an unoccupied niche, which they can occupy, and if competition is not huge, they can evolve and develop a new population. So this was the idea of the principle of divergence, according to which, from a species, we can have different populations which are varieties of the initial species, and eventually distinct species. And this is what you actually see in the only figure on the origin of species, the branching tree of life. So, in 1857, Darwin adds this idea to his writings. He had begun by that time to write a big book, a huge book that he would call Natural Selection. And in the manuscripts that are available, we see his shift from perfect to relative adaptation. What is relative adaptation? Simply put, that adaptation depends on the environment. There is no way we can think of perfect adaptation in any strict sense. It's not even relative. It always depends on the environment. And while he was working on his natural selection book, he received a letter by Alfred Russel Wallace, in which, according to Darwin, but Michael Ruse will explain to you that this is not true, Wallace described a similar theory. Indeed, there was a similar theory, but with very, very important differences as well. Nevertheless, this makes Darwin concerned that he will lose the priority of his theory. And so he wrote this letter to Charles Lyell saying that Wallace had managed to develop a similar theory, and if he had had his sketch written out in 1842, he could not have made a better short abstract. Even his terms he wrote now stand as heads of my chapters. And so he asked and eventually arranged, thanks to Lyell and Hooker, for a joint presentation at the Linnean Society. And in the meantime, he managed to confirm his priority because in 5 September 1857, he had already sent an abstract of his theory, which was based on the initial sketch, to Asa Gray, a botanist in the United States, in America. And there he had written in a letter that he had enclosed the briefest abstract of my notions on the means by which nature makes her species. This helped confirm the priority of Darwin in the theory. So a presentation was arranged, Neither Darwin was there because he had a problem with the family. One of his children was sick. Neither Wallace was there because he found out about this several months later. But eventually the presentation was made, the papers were read on natural selection. There was not any important reaction to that. And then Darwin rushed to write an abstract of his theory. I'm not sure if a book of 500 pages qualifies as an abstract, but this is how he came up with the book on the origin of species, which was published in 22 November 1859. So this completes the picture, and what you can see is a shift from perfect adaptation in a strict sense through limited perfection to relative adaptation. And according to the work of historians, and especially Dow Ospobat, this is the major shift in Darwin's thinking, which entails that neither in 1839, when we see when we see for the first time the idea of natural selection in Darwin's notebooks, nor in 1844, when he came up with the essay of the theory, do we see the theory that we see in the Origem. So Darwin did not publish for 20 years because the theory that he published in the Origem was not ready. And it was ready when he managed to collect the evidence that he wanted, undergoing in the meantime the shift that I'm showing you here. Now let us conclude by looking at the arguments in the book, The Origin of Species. He began with the idea of the struggle of existence in human societies from Malthus, and he drew the analogy to a struggle for existence in nature. This argument that there is a struggle for existence in nature was a crucial factor for another analogy from artificial selection to natural selection. And this is the first of the arguments in The Origin of Species. A bit later, he thought that there could be ecological specialization and divergence from initial forms, something that he drew by analogy again, either directly by Smith or through the idea of physiological division of labor in organisms by Miller Edwards. And this leads us to the two other arguments in the Origin of Species: transmutation, that species change, and common descent, which are collectively described as a tree of life. And this is what we find in the Origin of Species. If we want to put this in a scheme, here is what we see. I described earlier how we can have struggle for existence and evolution of particular population, but also divergence. And so here is natural selection. One population evolves to something else. Here is transmutation, when we have variation that gradually modifies the individuals, and eventually common descent, because these two populations have a common ancestor. And here are some excerpts from the Origin, where he's talking about the struggle of life and man's power of selection in describing the concept of natural selection. Both Malthus and artificial selection are here. We also see the idea of divergence. He's talking about diversified descendants that occupy many and widely diversified places. So that's the idea of ecological specialization, and this leads to the principle of divergence. And he's also talking about transmutation and the difficulties in sometimes distinguishing varieties from species, but he accepted the idea that varieties tend to become converted into new and distinct species. And eventually, common descent, when he writes that all animals and plants have descended from some one prototype, or that all the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth have descended from some one primordial form. So, having seen what Darwin eventually wrote in The Origin, I think that perhaps I have convinced you now that the important shift was not from theism to atheism, but from natural theology, the ideas of perfect adaptation of Paley that had influenced Darwin, to natural selection in the theory that we see in The Origin. And here is again the complete scheme of all this. Now, what does this leave for religion? In a letter to John Fordyce on 7 May 1879, Darwin expressed his views that there's no reason that one can say that in order to accept his theory, someone has to be an atheist. And he writes here, in my most extreme fluctuations, I've never been an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of God. I think that generally, and more as I grow older, but not always, that an agnostic would be the most correct description of my state of mind. Agnostic meaning that he did not know whether God existed or not. This is the same argument in his autobiography. I cannot pretend to throw out the least light on such abstruse problems. The mystery of the beginning of all things is insoluble by us, and I, for one, must be content to remain an agnostic. I feel most deeply that the whole subject is too profound for the human intellect. A dogma is as well speculate on the mind of Newton. Let each man hope and believe what he can. In short, he says that he doesn't know, and he does not want to say that God does not exist, and that each one of us should believe what each one of us thinks. And an interesting point, when he refers to Paley's argument, he writes here that the old argument of design in nature as given by Paley, which formerly seemed to me so conclusive, he was convinced, fails now that the law of natural selection has been discovered. We can no longer argue, for instance, the beautiful hinge of a bivalve shell must have been made by an intelligent being, like the hinge of a door by a man. There seems to be no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course which the wind blows. Everything in nature is the result of fixed laws. And I think that the shift that I showed you here is extremely well summarized by Darwin himself in this short essay, in this short text. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to discuss with you and answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Kostas. So wonderful, yeah. Let's do it this virtual reception for you. And so Marcelo will help me to organize the questions and answers. I just want to say quickly that I really appreciate your talk, Kostas. I never, well, I really envy your capacity to arrange things so different and difficult things that you bring together today, and in a beautiful way of arranging arguments, and the whole structure of your talk is amazing. So thank you for that. And so now it's with you guys.
Thank you very much, of course, for the kind words. And I'm very glad if that was useful and clear. And let's see if there are questions now.
Okay, João.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Kampourakis, for your kind presentation. And as Maria Elice said, I think the power of synthesis you gave us, at the same time having a depth on interpretation, was really impressive. So a first question I would have, if I'm not mistaken, the term agnostic was coined by, was formulated by Huxley in 1869. So I have a quote that Huxley said, "It simply means that a man shall not say he knows or believes that which he has no scientific grounds for professing to know or believe." So about the relation of Darwin to religion, I would like to know if you know something about the context of having this term on the debate about Huxley pointing towards being an agnostic. I don't know if you have some reference about some work that looked into public debate. How was Huxley motivated to have this term?
Yeah, No, the truth is that I know, of course, that Huxley coined the term. The term actually means, I mean, it's a Greek word. It means unknown. We do not know. But I recall that Adrian Desmond, in his book on Huxley, has written about this, but I do not remember the details now, to be honest, about how he ended up with that term. The important issue with Huxley is that his problem was not God or religion. His problem was the organized church. And this is what he was fighting, because as you may know, at that time, in order to become a professor, what we call today professor at the university, someone also had to be ordained in the Anglican Church. And what Huxley wanted to do was to make professionalize the work of a naturalist. So my own understanding then is that Huxley's enemy was not God or religion, but it was the system, the particular system that he had to deal with of how to do natural history in a professional manner.
Great, thank you. If there is time after, I would have another questions, but I will leave place for others. Thank you.
Yeah.
Your hand is the only hand raised, João. You can go on.
Well, I would also ask, you said that the letter to Asa Gray in 57 gave the priority to Darwin, but also at the end of his life, the correspondence to Asa Gray had some aspects of the place of chance in evolution, right? Because Asa Gray himself believed in God. I don't know if you could say anything more about this.
Yeah, well, there's an excellent analysis of the Darwin-Gray correspondence in a paper by Jim Lennox, published in 2010, if I remember correctly, in Perspective of Science, where he analyzes exactly that, how it was difficult to discuss about the difficulties in discussing about plan and design in nature, because it is very intuitive, as we know today, for us to perceive design. And it is difficult to talk about adaptation without talking about design. And as you know, I think it was Francisco Ayala who coined the term design without a designer, which of course causes other problems. You know, the notion that we have design, but we don't have a designer. But all I'm saying is that Darwin struggled with all these ideas, with all these problems throughout his life and in his writings. And he was, in my understanding, open to the criticisms that he received from his colleagues. One of the first criticisms he received actually was from Huxley. Huxley published an anonymous review the same year with Samuel Wilberforce, in which he wrote that what I presented, that Darwin did not actually manage to show that natural selection was responsible for creating new species.
Thank you.
So, Gabriel Vasto, you're the next, please.
Good morning, Professor. Thank you for the presentation. I think the movement from natural theology to natural selection you've chosen to show is very interesting and new to me. What I wanted to ask is more about education based on your paper, Charles Darwin and Evolution, Illustrating Human Aspect of Science. You argument in the paper that we should include the nature of science as a discussion in science classes on several education levels. I think the main problem with including it in science classes is that in the students' head, science is not mixable with history and history not with science. So you have history classes and biology classes. And my question is, in your opinion, how to overcome this separation that is almost naturally and artificial at the same time? because of the education system. Should we teach nature of science only in science classes, or should we teach nature of science in philosophy classes and history classes? So what is your opinion about it? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for this. Well, I'm very pessimistic, to be honest, about this, but I can give you an optimistic answer. But before saying that, I have to note that the shift I presented from natural theology to natural selection is not my discovery. This is Dov Vospovat who first proposed that, and unfortunately he died a bit afterwards. Actually, it was David Cohn who had his book published. Just to be clear, who found what. But I think that this is something that not many people have realized, because this is the work of historians that usually study that. And that's why I'm very happy to talk to biologists today, because not many biologists are aware of these issues. Now, returning to nature of science, there's no single answer to your question, because it all depends on the educational systems. But to give you an example, when I was a high school teacher, and I worked as a high school teacher for 12 years, I had the privilege to work in a private school in Greece that gave us opportunity to do other things. So along with a colleague who was an English literature teacher, we developed a course on the nature of science, which began with ideas of evolution in the English literature and ended up with the influence on Darwinism in literature. And in between, I presented what is in the article you read. Actually, this course is published in an article, in 2015 article, where we describe the course in detail. And so all I'm saying is that if there is good intention and collaboration among teachers, a lot can be done. But the problem is that when institutions separate the scholarship, this is difficult. But at the same time, in my view, there's no way you can understand science if you do not look at the philosophy and the history of science. And then you cannot understand the history of science or the philosophy of science if you do not look at the history and philosophy more broadly, because all these are interconnected. There's no way to understand what Darwin did if you do not understand the historiography of the time. So the reason I'm pessimistic is that whereas all these are interconnected, we have to separate these. We have with a question mark in order to develop the classes and the courses we teach at schools. But my optimistic answer is that when people from different backgrounds collaborate and bring together their expertise, historians, scientists, philosophers, I think that we can have well-developed and well-informed courses for both for schools and for the university.
Thank you.
Yeah. This being said, I told you in the beginning that in the university where I work, there are no classes on history and philosophy of biology for biologists. I actually had a book published last year, Philosophy of Science for Biologists, and I have no one to teach that to. This is how things are. So we can do what we can.
Okay. João?
Yes, thank you, Professor Kampourakis. I would have still another questions. I found it really interesting, the frame you showed us about the reasoning by analogy made by Darwin in several aspects, right? And I would like to know more, what do you think about the status of analogical reasoning or making inference by metaphors or images in science? Because we know that in a more logical positivism framework of analysis, we have Reichenbach and after Popper division between a context of discovery, context of justification, and all imagination, all analogical reasoning was dismissed as just the way to came into the idea, and the logical part was justification. Of course, this is now updated. We think that analogical reasoning has a constitutive part in the science making, but I would like to hear you about the status of analogy. Does it take part of the theory? Does it has a particular, what is the relation to regarding the logical structure of the theory, for instance?
I mean, you're talking about theories in general.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Also in the case of Darwin, because as you showed, it's very interesting because he had influences of economy, and so someone that is looking for a pure theory of biology could say, oh, this is a problem because you have an interference. It's not, yeah, but also in theories in general, if you may talk about this.
Yeah, well, there are many interesting things here. First, I should note that there's a book coming out on Darwin's analogical argument by Greg Radic and Jonathan Hodge. I have not seen it yet. It will be published by Cambridge University Press, but it will be out by the end of the year. I just know Greg told me about this, and I look forward to reading it. So there will be a book-length discussion of what Darwin did by expert historians. Now, analogy was crucial for Darwin, and what I find most interesting is not only the analogies themselves, but where they were based. So if you think about this, they were based on Adam Smith, Thomas Malthus, two political economists, and artificial selection. And as Greg has written in the past, Greg Radic has written in the past, this is no coincidence. It's no coincidence that it was Wallace who came up with a similar theory, because they had the same influences. It was Victorian society and its influences that influenced them to develop these kinds of thinking. Of course, with the means of the empire and things like that. Now, more broadly about theories, I think it's not only about analogies, it goes even further, it goes further to metaphors. I think that metaphor is inherent in science because scientists have no other way to describe something than to refer to something with which they are familiar. And actually, for instance, natural selection is a metaphor because nature does not select anything. And of course, these metaphors should not be interpreted as nature selecting, but as selection occurring in nature. And this can be considered a bad metaphor, but I think there are no good and bad metaphors because all have advantages and disadvantages. The problem is that usually the way scientists use these metaphors, and the more you think about concepts, the more you will realize that all of them or most of them are metaphors. The problem is that sometimes we focus on the aspect of the metaphor that fits well with what we know, and this masks other important aspects. To give you an example, when we say that there is selection in nature, we focus on those aspects, on those features that make selection occur, and we miss other important aspects as to, for instance, where do these features come from? And the important point and the difficult point for scientists, and this is where training in history and philosophy of science is essential, is to be explicit about the limits of the metaphors they use. Because metaphors are important and useful tools, but they also have limitations. And this is the difficult aspect. I have a chapter in that book I told you about where I have added that fifth element in the structure of metaphor, to say, yes, we use this metaphor for a purpose, but beware, this metaphor also has limitations, and keep them in mind in order to better understand how it works.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Professor Costas, we have a question in the chat from a student, Julia Nader, and I will read them. I read the question on behalf of her. And she asks, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering about the principles of divergence. I understand that these principles are related to relative adaptation, but I don't find evidence at the origins that relates these concepts. So do you think that Darwin made these relations explicitly? Thank you.
I think I showed you an excerpt from the Origem where he does this. I can show it again if you want. I mean, let me just share my screen again. Can you see that? Can you see the slide?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you see that he mentions the principle of divergence. This is where he defines the principle of divergence. And he's talking about diversified descendants that occupy diversified places. This is practically what I said, that this is the ecological division of labor. Those who are different enough from others, those individuals who are different enough from others to occupy different places in which the others cannot go, will have more chances in adapting there, these subpopulations. And after being separated, initially there are varieties of the same species, and eventually they can become different species. And this is how divergence works. Now, I have not noted here the exact page, but I'm sure you can find this in the Origem. I can just email me and send you the text. I don't remember the exact page right now, but he is explicit about this in the Origem. And the person who has written about this, as I showed you, is David Cohn. He has written a lot about the principle of divergence.
Okay, Professor Nélio Biso is here and wanted to make a question.
Good morning.
Hello.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Kampourakis. It was excellent. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, my question is about, well, we often listen about the Charles Darwin's ideas on the origin of species. But in this book, a very important issue is about extinction. He brings a new perspective on extinction. And in fact, when he was traveling in the Beagle, he was reading Charles Darwin's books, as you mentioned. And he read, for instance, that the ichthyosaurus could come back to the oceans if the climate would change. So this brought a very clear, this shows a very clear image of what was the concept of extinction with which he was dealing with. So my question is, don't you think that we should pay more attention to his ideas about extinction that he presented on the original species? Because they are very original as well as the ideas on the original species. So how a species end up is not also a very important issue.
I would say yes, of course. And I think a similar issue relates to his idea. I mean, it's not similar, but it's perhaps equivalent. We usually focus on, Darwin also wrote about use and disuse in the sense. And you probably know his provisional theory of pangenesis and how he explained how the story with the gemmules works and all that. And I think we often focus on the use, but not on the disuse. In a similar sense with what you say, we focus on the origin, on the extinction. I think Darwin was original in many ways, but I think we should also be careful that because there are many aspects of the theory which were simply not correct. And it is important to emphasize the aspects that are crucial. I think that the essence of evolutionary theory, it can be summarized in Darwin's own words: descent with modification. This is still the theory, but there's also a lot that has happened since then. So, if I may answer to your question with another question, Darwin's ideas were important. His ideas about extinction were important too. But at the same time, I would say perhaps we should be careful about how much we focus on Darwin, because the theory itself has evolved since then. So I think looking at Darwin for me is more important as a way to show how science is done and how we could teach science to people. For instance, many of the obstacles that Darwin himself had are obstacles that we find in students. And of course, students do not have to work for 20 years to collect evidence. We have this evidence now. But at the same time, there is a danger of overemphasizing Darwin's work, because then those people who do not like the theory of the ideas, we'll find problems and flaws, which is, of course, very interesting. And I'm saying this inspired, I don't know if you have seen that recent editorial in Science by Agustin Fuentes on the descent of man and the reaction he caused. So he wrote that Darwin in the descent of man was racist and sexist, and many people together today draw on this to justify their racism and sexism. And since I read the editorial, I've been thinking, I have no answer to that. Well, he was a man of his time, and this is what most people were thinking at that time. But on the other way, can we ignore that he has the statements that he has in the Descent of Man? And the decision, I think, is difficult. So all I'm saying is that, more broadly from what you asked, of course, we have to point out when he was original, but at the same time, I think we have to be cautious on the elements we choose to discuss, because the theory itself is different today. I'm not sure if I have answered your question.
Well, I know what he wrote about vaccination, for instance, in the Descent of Man, and how this discussion would be, nowadays it would be very hard to discuss his views on vaccination. But anyway, I think that he disagreed with Lyell to some extent about extinction, because I think that he put forward a very modern concept of extinction. And creationists, for instance, they not only say that species can be created, but they were created, but they say that species can be created. So extinction is not a real issue for creationists. And I think that we have a very very good point here to discuss conservation using Charles Darwin's original views about extinction. He used to say that extinction is forever. And this was a very original concept at that time.
Yeah, I think you're right. To be honest, I have not thought much about this, but as Glenn will probably explain, creationist is a continuum of different views that we usually lump together under the name, and you can find a variety. And in any case, the problem with these people is political, I think, is not scientific. I mean, because you can always find argument to fight something that you do not like, whether you're right or not. But I think you're right about the concept. I'm not sure exactly, I don't remember now the details of the difference between him and Lyell. So I will say that it is important to keep those elements today that were useful and still apply. Of course, I agree with you.
Okay, next one is João Gabriel. João, are you there?
Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
First of all, thank you so much for this amazing lecture. I noticed that in your book's conclusion that we read, you emphasize a lot on the role of 19th century British society's views on nature and progress on Darwin's work, as well as how this influence probably came to him through his colleagues and his predecessors. Since it is well known that Darwin took inspiration from works of quite varied backgrounds, such as geology, paleontology, even economy and religion, how different do you think modern society shapes science nowadays? And also, I would like to ask your opinion about are we better or worse at integrating different areas of knowledge when comparing to this Darwin's period? I know it's a bit of a general question, but that's something that I really couldn't get out of my mind while reading it.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if we are better or worse, but there are two actual problems. The first is that knowledge today is so much more than what it was at the time. At the same time, the means to transmit this knowledge are a lot more as well. Now, at the time, you would find these people like Francis Galton, who would be described as polymaths, because they were able to do a variety of things. Similar was the case for Herbert Spencer. I think Darwin would be described as one. I'm not sure you can find polymaths today, because there's so much to know that you cannot really be a polymath. This being said, the availability, I mean, how quickly available knowledge is today with the internet and everything, can at the same time perhaps help us counter this problem of how to handle this knowledge. So the question is, I think the big problem is the motivation and the realization that you need to bring these different fields together. Now, scientists today, I'm inclined to think that are too focused on their work, getting published, getting grants, do this specific enzyme or this specific sequence or whatever, and sometimes are not able to convey the broader picture, even if themselves they see it. And this is an issue. For instance, you will not find many scientists writing books for the broad public in order to raise these issues. So my short answer would be, I do not know if we're better or worse, because we have different problems. We have a lot more knowledge, but we also have many means to convey this knowledge. 25 years ago, when I was a student, there was no internet. You probably don't know that, and many of you do not know that, and I'm not that old, but the internet that we're using today is something very, very recent. I remember going to get the CDs with the PubMed articles when I was an undergraduate student and things like that. But I think what we have to pay attention to is the extreme specialization. And this brings me back to the point I made earlier. I think that all scientists should have classes on philosophy, on history, perhaps on sociology, to get this kind of background. I do not know how things work in Brazil. I know, for instance, that in the States, people begin in the college and get different kinds of courses. But in Europe, for instance, things are extremely specialized. So you will get a degree in biochemistry, in chemistry, or molecular biology without ever listen to a single word about the humanities and how important they are. So I think in terms of society, the inevitable specialization that we're dealing with is a fact that might be countered with a different perspective on education. But then, of course, education is a personal issue. I went to the Down House and I was amazed by looking at Darwin's books and how many different kinds of books he was reading. I've never read literature seriously. I don't have the time or the space. But I'm not sure if this is because of the era I'm living in or because of the mentality of the era. This is something that it's hard to know at this point. And I'm sorry, you asked another question I didn't answer. I recall two questions, but I've now forgotten which one. Was there another question in what you asked?
I think that you answered both of them,
Okay.
because I asked what your opinion was about if it better or worse, but also how our society shapes science today. And I think it has a lot to do with what you just said about the fact that you never really got time to read so much about other stuff that doesn't come from scientific background. And yeah, maybe there's this reflection of our times, of our mentalities, of the way that we have to prepare ourselves with so much knowledge, with so much scientific literature nowadays. And yeah, I think I actually think quite similar with what you said.
Just the last point, you have to remember that neither Darwin nor Galton ever had to work.
That is very important.
They never had to work to earn their living. Of course, I admire them because even if they had the money, they didn't spend it in useless things. They spent the money to advance scholarship and to advance knowledge. But the fact that they never had to work is very important in terms of how much time this gives one to read and write. I already thinking about the time I will have in retirement, even though it's in 20 years from now. But right now I have to work as well. So, I mean, we should not idealize these people. We should admire. I honestly admire someone who has money and spends his time doing scholarship. I do not know if I would do it, but I admire these people. But at the same time, we have to remember that many of these people had solved practical problems that many others, even today, have to deal with.
Yes, I completely agree with you, especially in the third, in countries with big social problems like Brazil, but not just Brazil, but yeah. Thank you for your answer.
You're welcome.
Okay, there's another question in the chat, a question from Flavio Ferreira. He said, "Good morning and thanks for the presentation, Professor Costas. One of the Darwin's sons became a eugenics politician and a geneticist. Did the father's work have influenced his son's career?"
Okay, so I do not know the answer if there was an influence by Darwin. Perhaps there was an influence by social Darwinism, but this was Spencer, it wasn't Darwin himself. Now, speaking of eugenicism, I mean, I think that all geneticists of the time were eugenicists, if you look at that. And this is another important issue. We blame something today that had devastating effects. The Holocaust was the worst one, but there were also sterilizations and things like that. If I remember correctly, sterilizations were done in Switzerland, where I live, until the 1970s. But I will have to check that. But at the same time, we have to realize that this was something that many people, if not most people at the time, agreed with. This does not justify what they did, but it can explain that, you know, when there's a general tendency and people follow it, you cannot blame someone for being an eugenicist when everybody or almost everybody was an eugenicist. And there's a great book by David Depew and a colleague about how some biologists, including Brzezinski, I think, and many anthropologists were among the few to react at the predominant view at the time. I think it's called, I think I have it here. That's the one. Darwinism, Democracy and Race by John Jackson and David Depew. But I think that I do not know the particular origins of Darwin's son, but I know that that was the case for many people at the time. So one might perhaps have to wonder why all those people at the time were proponents of eugenics. I saw that Nelio.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nelio, go on.
Yes, well, I also have a book here. So it is a book by Leonard Darwin, The Need for Eugenic Reform. I cannot read. The Need for Eugenic Reform by Leonard Darwin, written in 1926. And in the first piece, it's written, I do not know if these words are true, but anyway, are Leonard Darwin's words. Dedicated to the memory of my father, for if I had not believed that he would have wished me to give such help as I could towards making his life's work of service to mankind, I should never have been led to write this book.
So I think you answered the question.
Well, it's a terrible book, actually. It's
Yeah.
a terrible book. But anyway, these are Leonard Darwin's own words.
Yeah. I've not read the book, but again, I will ask the question: is he influenced by Darwin himself or by social Darwinism, which is Spencerism?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if Darwin would agree with Spencerism and social Darwinism. And you know, of course, the story with the survival of the fittest, another metaphor to replace natural selection, which was probably even worse. And as David Epure again has shown, that does not represent Darwin's thinking. Darwin had a creative view of natural selection where slight variations coexist. It was not an eliminative view of natural selection.
Yes, despite the fact that at the end of the chapter 7, he uses very harsh words to describe the weak and the strong who would survive. But anyway, I agree with you.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned that earlier, I think about the descent of man. I think it's there when he says that essentially medicine does not let natural selection work.
Exactly. Vaccination and...
yeah.
Okay, I think the next one is Anderson. Are you there? Let me see you. Anderson?
He was here, maybe.
Yeah.
He lost connection.
Okay, I will keep his hand raised, and I will read another question from the chat. A question from Leticia and Murilo, two of our students. And they ask, considering that the social, cultural, and political context of Darwin's period influenced the development of his ideas, culminating in the formulation of the theory of natural selection as it is, and that the very acceptance of this theory also depends on the cultural view on the subject, in this case, general population view in relation to nature. How do you think the cultural, social, and political context of the present times influence the acceptance of Darwin's theory of natural selection as it was proposed, and also the synthetic theory of evolution?
Well, there are so many different cultural and political contexts that I could not give a single answer. There was a huge collection of chapters, I forget the name of the historian now, about the reception of Darwinism in various countries. It was Thomas Glick. Thomas Glick, they did a book back in the 80s, I think, about the reception of Darwinism. And more recently, a huge double volume set of how it was received in various countries. So if you look at that, there are so many different contexts that my answer would be depends. To give you an example, I mean, if you go to the United States, which is a single country, there's so many differences between, for instance, the northeastern states and the southern states, which you might not find, for instance, in Europe. I think the reaction in Europe would be more homogeneous. I do not know what is going on in your part of the world, even though I know that there are political problems in relation with creationism and things like that. So my short answer would be that there have been many reactions, different kinds of reactions in different contexts, and one would have to specify what we're talking about, because the reactions have been different. Now, about the synthetic theory of evolution, or even the extended synthesis that people are talking about today, I think that most people do not get to that part to understand the broader theory. If we're talking about the public, I think the public usually sticks with natural selection and Darwin. They do not get a sense of, you know, the more advanced and more complete theories that we have today. And perhaps that's a problem, because I've seen some cases where people, you know, react to simplistic versions of evolutionary theory, and you tell them that, look, it's not only that, and it's not even only what Darwin said. We currently know a lot more. Evolution has not only historical aspects, but also experimental aspects that have shown a variety of things. So I think the answer to your question is twofold. First, it depends on the context. And second, unfortunately, most people come across very simplistic versions of this theory. And this makes resistance in combination with political and religious factors. I would say political mostly, because religion is integrated in a political views, result in the resistance that we find in Poles and elsewhere. I hope I have answered the question.
Okay, thank you. I think Anderson has returned. So Anderson, can you ask your question?
Yeah. Yes, I'm here now. My connection is a bit problematic today, but if there's a problem, let me know, okay? So first, I would like to thank you, Professor, for your presentation. It's a privilege to have you here, okay? And I read your paper, Charles Darwin's and Evolution, illustrating human aspects of science, which I really appreciate. I learned a lot reading and really like it. So in your paper, you highlight the creativity, social aspects, and subjectivity of Darwin's work, an extremely good analysis, in my opinion. And worldwide, especially in Brazil, the United States, we have been seeing a wave of denial. For instance, a president supporting medicines without efficiency, ignoring the scientists' suggestions, and so on. So I feel this issue has been making the science, especially in Brazil, in Brazilian context, reinforce positivist views of science. In other words, scientists are trying to convince that science is based by a total objectivity, denying relation between science and social political aspect, considering neutral. Everything made in order to face the denial. So despite of being in the side of scientists for clear reasons, the positivism of scientists makes me feel worried. And I think most of the historians and philosophers of science. So I would like to know, in your opinion, how can you solve this tension? Romanticize science for a general audience, or show science how it really is, besides its good and bad?
Yeah, I have no answer to this question exactly because it's so difficult. But let me tell you something. There's a great guy whom I've never met, but we are in contact online like many others, Adam Latz. He's a historian. And once he made this amazing post on Twitter. He said, I like Richard Dawkins and Jory Coyne very much. I've learned a lot about evolution from their books, but asking them about creationism is like asking a cardiologist about heartbreak. And what he means by that is that there are not only conceptual but also emotional obstacles that relate to resistance of all kinds, be it evolution or vaccination. There's a great book that just came out, but I've only skimmed through it, by Heidi Larsson. It's called Stuck, Why Vaccine Rumors Persist, something like that's the title. It just came out a few weeks ago. And she's talking about the problems with resistance that do not have to do with showing the evidence only. Of course, showing the evidence, explaining the science is important, but I think the most important thing is to address the concerns of these people. So if we go and tell these people, you're stupid, you don't understand the science, there's no way they're going to listen to us. What we should do, I think, in the contrary, is listen to them, listen to the concerns they express, and try to explain to them what we know and what we do not know. This then brings us to another problem, for which a colleague and I, we've written a whole book. People want science to be authoritative and certain, but uncertainty is inherent in science. And anybody who has followed this pandemic so far will have realized that there are a lot of things about which we were uncertain, We are still uncertain, and we will be uncertain. For instance, I have a good friend who asked me which of the vaccines has less long-term effects. And I told him, I do not know. Nobody knows. How can we know about the long-term effects of vaccines that were produced less than a year ago? I told him that I don't expect them to exist given the evidence that we have, but nobody can know until we have several years gone by. But my friend was not satisfied by the answer. He wanted to be certain, and he wanted someone like me who understands the science, even though I'm not an expert in vaccines, to reassure him. So what I'm saying is that taking a strong positivist stance, I think is the wrong way to go. What scientists have to do is to try to explain to people that, look, uncertainty is inherent in science, but at the same time, because we are aware of this uncertainty, science is the most solid knowledge we can have about the natural world, exactly because we are aware of the limitations and the problems that we deal with. Now, how effective this can be remains to be seen, but it's hard. I hope I have answered your question.
Okay, let me check. Luis Henrique Rolo, are you there? You're the next one in the list.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, thank you, Professor Costas, for your presentation. It was really great. And my question is, we see that Darwin was influenced by other science that was not biology, as you say, Thomas Malthus and Adam Smith. My question is, was Darwin able to see the application of his biology to the area of human affairs, more specifically, to a natural scientific justification of war? Because in some aspects, the natural selection can be seen as a violent selection.
Well, Darwin was certainly aware of the violence that exists in nature. He wrote about this in many occasions in his books. And the big problem with evolution is exactly that. I think it was Peter Bowler who wrote in one of his books that death is the driving force of change. And he's right, because it's the death of some people that perhaps allows, of some individuals that perhaps allows others to survive and reproduce and all that. But I think there's a crucial difference between what goes on in nature and what goes on in human societies, because it has been a long time since we stopped living in natural environments. We have been living in artificial environments, in my view, at least since we began relying on agriculture. And this means that you cannot talk today, in my view, about natural selection among humans, because it's not always natural. Of course, there are natural disasters, but I mean, we're not threatened by lions or predators today, at least for the majority of people living on Earth. So we have to keep in mind that for a long time, humans have been living in artificial environments, and that perhaps there have been cases of artificial selection, either through eugenics or through other ways that we have not realized. I mean, politics of reproduction and heredity in the various countries, it depends. Now, what Darwin would think about how his views would be used, I'm not sure he agreed with Spencer and what we call mistakenly perhaps social Darwinism. But my own understanding is that it's not simple to apply this theory about the natural world to social issues. And I think it's Bob Richards who has written about, he has a book about Darwin and Hitler, and this notion that all this story of that ended up with the Holocaust was inspired by Darwin's theory. And actually, if you look at the details, I'm not sure if Bob Richards says that, I don't remember if I read it in his book or elsewhere, the Nazis were mostly inspired by what was going on in the US and the eugenics in the US, rather than Darwin himself, because there were applications of that. And of course, today we have other issues. This gives me opportunity. I mean, I'm working on a book now related to ancestry tests and human genetic variation. And there is this whole discussion among geneticists about whether we have or we do not have clusters of human variation. And of course, they say that races do not exist, but we have genetically distinct populations, which is not always clear if you look at the sampling that they do. Where do they collect the samples? And then there's another related myth, it seems to me, that, you know, human migration began in the 14th century when Europeans spread around the world. But if you look at history, migration was always taking place everywhere. It was just that the pace was different. So all I'm saying is that, again, to understand what is going on, we have to look at broader disciplines and to make conclusions. Just applying in a simplistic manner evolutionary theory to society, or thinking that it can be applied like this, is perhaps due to our not being aware of the broader issues or the broader scholarship about all this. And one eventually has to end up being a polymath, which is difficult, but one has to be able to understand how various disciplines address these issues. So for the issues that you mentioned, we have political science, we have sociology, we have history, and other different disciplines that one has to consider. And because I see now that Maria Elice has mentioned Dawkins, this brings something to mind. Dawkins once made a post that eugenics is possible as a science. It is just that we do not do it for ethical reasons. I think geneticists would say that no, eugenics is not possible because we cannot select for the traits we want to select. I mean, even for height, we have thousands of variants that affect height, which we know that its heritability is 80%, which means that the differences among ourselves are 80% due to differences in our genes. So imagine, you know, intelligence and things like that. No, we cannot. And there is a related discussion recently about polygenic risk scores. And this is something that is very interesting because many people think that we can still rely on DNA to solve problems, societal problems, whereas perhaps we should look at our society, you know, address the inequalities. The inequalities in the States might be related to race. Here in Europe, I can tell you, have to do with ethnicities, natives and migrants. I'm not sure what the issues are in South America. I know that people there think differently about their mixed ancestries and things like that, but everybody has a mixed ancestry anyway.
I think here we are more familiar with this intermix, and at least we have the illusion, I think, that we are open to this mixing, and I'm not sure if we really are. I'm talking about this because the racism that it's present among Brazilian people, but it's a kind of racism that is not completely assumed.
Yeah. Yeah, these are very difficult issues, and the problem is that sometimes people use genetics and evolution, the science, to justify racial or ethnic purity, whereas nothing like this exists. I mean, and here scientists have a role to play. In the big studies of human genetic diversity, the collection was done on the basis that you have 4 grandfathers in the same country. So, okay, as far as I know, all my grandparents, not grandfathers, all my grandparents were born in Greece and lived all their lives in Greece. But how can I know what happened before that? So making a claim that I'm a pure Greek, it's just nonsense, because people have been migrating. Of course, in the case of my country of origin, perhaps the migrations are quite regional. We never had colonies beyond the Mediterranean, but people have been intermixing and moving around all the time. And this is, for instance, something that scientists can help communicate. But then when you see that those maps of the Y DNA or mtDNA haplotypes, which show the dispersal of the haplotypes around the world, this gives the impression that people moved and then stayed there, which is not the case. People have been moving all the time, everywhere. So what I could say in relation to the question I'm trying to answer is that we do not use science properly to explain the complexities of this phenomena. Perhaps because we want to find clear answers that do not exist.
I once watched this a marketing piece for this hereditary tests, and they made this a bunch of interviews with people, first asking them to tell about ancestry of the family, and after that they made the test with these people and showed the surprise they had with the result. They never imagined where they came from.
Yeah, but at the same time, they didn't tell them that if they have 8 or 16 or 32 genealogical ancestors, they do not get DNA from all of them.
Sure.
So genetic ancestry, which is reflected in DNA, is just a portion of the genealogical ancestry. So we all have ancestors from whom we have not inherited DNA. So any DNA will not reveal our true ancestry. It will just show where our DNA comes from, but that's it. Because I think I watched the same, and I remember a lady crying because she was told that she was from a different part of Africa from where she thought she came from. And I don't remember them explaining to her that, look, perhaps you just got that part, you didn't get the other part.
Sure. Nice. I think we don't have more questions. Costas, it's amazing how huge is your connection and your editorial profile. We can see when you answer all these questions and remembering so many authors and words and books about the different issues and subjects. We have this in the questions today, so it's amazing. It's that convinced me that I made a really great choice when I invited you.
Thank you very much, but I have to say, I'm horrified by how much I do not know.
Oh, sure.
This is the most horrifying part. There's so much I do not know, and I still have not read. The book that Nelio mentioned, I have not read it. And I don't think I remembered that it existed. So you see, it's terrifying. But we still have time to cover that. The problem is, I think that the difficult thing is to have an understanding of the different disciplines, which, of course, if one has that, it may result that that person is expert on nothing when you end up, taking these things around. But the good thing with working on education, as I do, is that it gives you the opportunity and the motivation to look at different disciplines. And I think it's very important. But yet there's so much that one has to know that it's impossible to cover everything. If I could answer your questions, I'm very glad. And actually, you mentioned the series I'm doing with Cambridge University Press. These are books for a broad audience. And the main reason I did that is that I said, I cannot write all these books, but let's find people who can take an interdisciplinary perspective and present these issues to a broad audience. I mean, we have a book on metaphors in the life sciences coming out, which is not strictly philosophical. It's for a general audience so that people can get a sense of how this works. Michael Roos is writing a book on natural selection for the series. And I asked him to explain the problems with the concept, how it was coined, how it was replaced, how it was modified later. So I think that bringing, I mean, if I'm trying to do something is to bring this scholarship to be interested people. Unfortunately, many people do not read at all. But for those who read, I think it's critical to provide them with books that are affordable. These books cost less than $15. And I can actually show you them to you. These are the ones that we have. Evo, Devo, Development, Evolution, and the one on the coronavirus. So I think what I'm trying to do is to bring this scholarship and knowledge to a broader audience. And I think this is something that experts themselves, the scientists themselves, should also try to do somehow.
Very good, very good. We have Nélio Biso. I didn't present you in the beginning. He was with the camera closed, but he is someone that used to publish a lot too, and he has this kind of the same quality you have as being a didactic writer.
Yeah, I'm aware of his work. I'm aware that he has written. One issue, of course, is that I cannot read all things. But you remember your own experience with your book. Just to give a confirmation. I read the review about a book in Portuguese and Spanish. The review was in English. And I said, okay, this book is good, but what can we do with that? And luckily, you accepted to redo the book. And now it's available to everyone else. So I think that's the contribution that all of us can do. Bring knowledge, make knowledge as accessible as possible.
That's true. Yeah, that's your mark, Costas. Thank you. So we have, I don't know, Nélio, do you want to talk something?
I just want to thank very much for Costas' availability to be here with all your students, Maria Elice. And again, I want to congratulate you for organizing these sessions. Really, they are wonderful. I have been learning a lot today as well. So thank you very much, Costas Kampourakis. I have been reading as much as I can, not everything, but many writings by yourself and Lennox. I have some doubts about. I'd like to discuss with you some issues about teleology together with Lennox. I'm not sure if you know Mario Vegetti's work, the Italian philosopher that died a few years ago. So
no, I'm not sure I do.
Yeah, but he has a very different perspective on teleology, and maybe we can have.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to say that, of course, Jim himself says that his perspective is not the mainstream. He thinks of it as being radical, but I think he's right. I tend to agree with him. But for practical purposes, there is a paper I wrote last year in Evolution, Education and Outreach, which is open access, where I treat the same issues for teachers. So you might want to read that, and I would be happy to discuss. I'm just saying that my primary aim is not to resolve the philosophical issues. My primary aim is to use philosophy to address the understanding of science.
Great. That's the same track that we have here in Brazil. So thank you very much again for spending your time with us.
It has been a pleasure. And again, as I told you in the beginning, I'm grateful to Maria Elice for inviting me in this.
Okay. Very nice. Thank you, Costas. Thank you, everybody. And we'll be here at 10:30 in the Discord. So yeah, let's do it again. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.